At 6:58 a.m. on October 25, 1944, Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer, watching four Japanese battleships emerge from the morning haze 15 miles northwest of his position off the coast of Samar in the Philippines. Behind those four battleships were 8 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers, the most powerful surface combat force Japan had assembled since the Battle of Midway. The Japanese flagship, Yamato, was the largest battleship ever built, displacing 72,000 tons with 18-inch guns that could fire shells weighing 3,200 pounds to a range of 26 miles. USS Johnston displaced 2,050 tons. Evans commanded a destroyer screening 6 escort carriers, small aircraft carriers designed to support amphibious operations, not fight battleships. The escort carriers, collectively called Taffy 3, were slow, lightly armed, and completely unprepared for surface combat. Behind them were American landing forces invading Leyte Gulf, vulnerable and exposed. Between the Japanese battleships and those helpless transports stood Ernest Evans and the 7 ships of his screening force. Standard naval doctrine said destroyers avoided battleships. Battleships had armor measured in feet of steel. Destroyers had armor measured in inches. Battleships had guns that could sink destroyers with single hits from 20 miles away. Destroyers had guns that couldn't penetrate battleship armor even at point-blank range. The mathematics said Evans should retreat, lay smoke, protect the carriers while they ran. Nobody would blame him for avoiding suicide. Evans picked up the ship's intercom and spoke to his crew. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he were announcing a routine training exercise rather than probable death. A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and a number of destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. Then he turned to his helmsman and gave an order that would earn him the Medal of Honor posthumously and make USS Johnston legendary. All ahead flank, come left to course 270, we're attacking. The helmsman stared at him, thinking he'd misheard. Sir, did you say attacking? Evans nodded. We're charging the battleships. If we're going to die, we're going to die like destroyer men. In the next 2 hours and 37 minutes, USS Johnston would charge 4 battleships, fire every torpedo and shell she carried, take over 40 direct hits from battleship and cruiser guns, lose power, steering, and most of her weapons, and fight until she sank beneath the waves. She would damage battleship Yamato, sink heavy cruiser Kumano, and so disrupt the Japanese attack that all 6 escort carriers would escape. Ernest Evans would go down with his ship, the first Native American in the Navy to receive the Medal of Honor, and the battle off Samar would be remembered as the greatest mismatch in naval history, where the smaller force won. If you want to see how one destroyer charged 4 battleships and saved an entire fleet, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories of impossible courage and calculated sacrifice. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the battle where destroyers fought battleships and won through sheer audacity. Back to October 25th, 1944, and the morning that changed naval warfare forever. Ernest Edwin Evans was born on August 13, 1908, in Pawnee, Oklahoma, to part Cherokee father and mother of mixed European and Native American ancestry. He grew up in Oklahoma during the oil boom years, when the state was rapidly modernizing, but Native Americans still faced discrimination and limited opportunities. His father worked various jobs. His mother raised 6 children. Money was scarce, opportunities were limited, but education was emphasized. Evans graduated from high school in 1926, one of only a handful of Native Americans in his class to complete secondary education. He worked odd jobs for several years, saving money while studying for the Naval Academy entrance examination. In 1927, he received appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis through competitive examination, one of the few Native Americans to attend the academy in that era. At Annapolis, he faced discrimination from classmates who questioned whether Indians belonged in the officer corps. Some midshipmen refused to room with him. Some officers questioned his fitness for command. Evans responded by outperforming his critics academically and athletically. He graduated in 1931, ranked in the top third of his class, receiving commission as ensign. His Native American heritage, initially seen as liability, would later define his command philosophy and aggressive tactical instincts. He spent the 1930s serving aboard various ships, learning seamanship and naval tactics, slowly advancing through the ranks. By 1941, he was a lieutenant commander with reputation as an aggressive, skilled officer who led from the front. The Navy assigned him to command positions on destroyers, the small warships that screened larger vessels and conducted independent operations. Evans excelled at destroyer tactics, understanding that destroyers survived through speed and aggression, not through caution. In September 1943, the Navy promoted him to commander and gave him command of USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer being built at Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding Corporation. Fletcher-class destroyers were the most advanced destroyers America had produced, incorporating lessons learned from 2 years of Pacific combat. Technical specifications demonstrated their capabilities and limitations compared to the battleships they would soon face. USS Johnston, hull number DD-557, commissioned October 27, 1943. Length overall, 376 feet 5 inches. Beam, 39 feet 7 inches. Draft, 17 feet 9 inches. Displacement, 2,050 tons standard, 3,050 tons fully loaded. Powered by 2 sets of General Electric turbines producing 60,000 shaft horsepower, driving 2 propellers. Maximum speed, 38 knots, approximately 44 miles per hour. Range at cruising speed, 6,500 nautical miles. Crew complement, 327 officers and enlisted men. Armament consisted of 5 5-inch to 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, 5 guns that could engage both surface targets and aircraft. Maximum range against surface targets, approximately 18,000 yards, 9 nautical miles. Against battleships with 26-mile gun range, Johnston would have to close to 1/3 that distance before she could shoot back. 10 40mm anti-aircraft guns and 7 20mm anti-aircraft guns provided additional firepower against aircraft, but were useless against armored warships. The primary offensive weapons were 10 21-inch torpedo tubes arranged in 2 5-tube mounts. The torpedoes were Mark 15 steam torpedoes, 24 feet long, 21 inches in diameter, weighing 6,300 pounds, including 825-pound Torpex warhead. Range at 45-knot speed setting was approximately 6,000 yards. The torpedoes could damage or sink any ship they hit, but they had to be launched at close range, requiring the destroyer to charge directly at enemy ships while under fire. For comparison, the Japanese battleship Yamato, which Johnston would soon attack, displaced 72,000 tons, 35 times Johnston's displacement. Yamato's main armament consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, firing 3,200-pound shells to 45,000-yard range, more than twice Johnston's maximum gun range. Yamato's armor belt was 16 inches thick, impervious to Johnston's 5-inch shells at any range. A single salvo from Yamato's main guns, if it hit Johnston, would disintegrate the destroyer instantly. Evans understood these numbers perfectly. He also understood that naval combat wasn't purely mathematical. Aggression, surprise, and willingness to accept casualties could defeat superior forces if applied correctly. He told his crew during commissioning ceremony in October 1943, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off. Johnston deployed to the Pacific in February 1944, joining the U.S. 7th Fleet, operating in support of General Douglas MacArthur's campaign to retake the Philippines. Between February and October 1944, Johnston participated in multiple amphibious operations, providing shore bombardment, anti-aircraft defense, and screening for vulnerable transport ships. Evans's aggressive leadership earned respect from his crew and recognition from his superiors. By October 1944, American forces were invading Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, a critical operation that would cut Japanese communications between their southern resource areas and the home islands. The Japanese Navy, recognizing the strategic importance of the Philippines, committed nearly every remaining warship to destroying the American invasion fleet. The plan called for 3 separate forces to converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions, overwhelming American defenses through numerical superiority and coordination. The Japanese Center Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, was the most powerful of the 3 groups: 4 battleships, Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, and Kongo; 8 heavy cruisers, Atago, Takao, Maya, Chokai, Myoko, Haguro, Kumano, and Suzuya; 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. This force represented Japan's remaining naval strength in heavy surface combatants, everything they had left to change the war's outcome. American intelligence tracked Center Force as it approached the Philippines from the west, threading through the central Philippine Islands toward Leyte Gulf. On October 24, 1944, American submarines and carrier aircraft attacked Center Force in the Sibuyan Sea, sinking battleship Musashi and damaging several other ships. Admiral Kurita temporarily withdrew westward, and American commanders assumed Center Force had been defeated and was retreating. But Kurita turned back during the night of October 24-25, passing through San Bernardino Strait between Philippine Islands and emerging into the Philippine Sea east of Samar Island at dawn on October 25th. No American heavy warships were positioned to intercept him. Admiral William Halsey had taken the main American battle fleet north to engage Japanese carriers, assuming Center Force was no longer a threat. The only forces between Kurita's battleships and the vulnerable invasion fleet were 3 groups of escort carriers and their destroyer escorts, designated Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Taffy 3, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, consisted of 6 escort carriers and 7 screening ships, 3 destroyers including USS Johnston, and 4 destroyer escorts. Escort carriers were small aircraft carriers, approximately 500 feet long, displacing 10,000 tons, designed to support amphibious operations by providing air cover and anti-submarine patrol. They were not designed or equipped for surface combat. Their maximum speed was 19 knots, half the speed of Johnston, and 1/3 the speed of Japanese battleships capable of 30 knots. At 6:45 a.m. on October 25th, lookouts aboard escort carrier Fanshawe Bay spotted pagoda-style masts on the horizon, characteristic of Japanese battleships. At 6:47 a.m., radar confirmed multiple large contacts approaching from the northwest at high speed. At 6:50 a.m., Japanese battleships opened fire from 35,000 yards, their shells falling in colored splashes around the escort carriers. Red, green, blue, and yellow dye markers in the shells allowed Japanese gunners to identify which ships were firing, adjusting their aim based on splash colors. Admiral Sprague ordered his carriers to turn southeast, running away from the Japanese force, and to launch all available aircraft. He ordered his screening ships to lay a smoke to conceal the carriers and prepare for torpedo attacks. This was standard doctrine. Destroyers sacrificed themselves to allow carriers to escape. But nobody expected destroyers to actually attack battleships. The assumption was they would launch torpedoes from maximum range, approximately 10,000 yards, then withdraw. Nobody expected a destroyer to charge directly at 4 battleships. Ernest Evans didn't believe in standard doctrine when it meant watching carriers get destroyed. At 6:58 a.m., without waiting for orders from Admiral Sprague, he ordered Johnston to attack. The destroyer surged forward at flank speed, 38 knots, closing the range to the Japanese battleships at mile per minute. Black smoke poured from her stacks as engine room crew pushed the turbines beyond rated capacity. Evans stood on the bridge, binoculars focused on the approaching enemy, calculating firing solutions in his head. At 7:10 a.m., range to nearest Japanese battleship, identified as Kongo class, was 18,000 yards, 9 miles. This was maximum effective range for Johnston's 5-inch guns. Evans ordered commence firing. Johnston's 5 guns began firing as fast as crews could load them, approximately 8 rounds per minute per gun. Total rate of fire, 40 rounds per minute. The 54-pound shells arced through the air, taking 25 seconds to reach their targets at maximum range. Against battleship armor, the shells were essentially harmless, but they served tactical purposes, distracting Japanese gunners, forcing battleships to maneuver, buying seconds of time. Japanese battleships returned fire. At 7:12 a.m., an 18-inch shell from Yamato passed 50 feet above Johnston's bridge, the displacement of air from its passage shaking the entire ship. If that shell had hit Johnston, the ship would have been destroyed instantly. The shell continued for another mile before hitting the water, creating a splash 100 feet high. Evans watched it pass and kept charging. At 7:15 a.m., range was 10,000 yards, 5 miles. This was within Johnston's torpedo range. Evans ordered his torpedo officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, to prepare for torpedo launch. Hagen was a 26-year-old officer from California who had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1940. He had calculated hundreds of torpedo firing solutions during training, but had never fired at actual enemy ships under combat conditions. Now, he was calculating a firing solution against the largest battleship ever built, while his own ship was being straddled by 18-inch shells. Hagen worked at the torpedo director, a mechanical computer that calculated the complex geometry of torpedo attacks. He needed to input target course, target speed, range, Johnston's course, Johnston's speed, torpedo speed, and estimate of the time before target would maneuver. The calculations had to account for the fact that Johnston was moving at 38 knots toward targets moving at 30 knots in different direction. The torpedoes would travel at 45 knots. Everything was in motion simultaneously. The torpedoes would take approximately 4 minutes to reach their targets. In 4 minutes, a battleship traveling at 30 knots would move over 2 miles. Hagen had to calculate where the battleships would be 4 minutes in the future and aim the torpedoes at that point in space. Additionally, he had to account for the fact that Japanese ships would attempt evasive maneuvers once they detected torpedo wakes. Japanese lookouts were trained to spot torpedo wakes from miles away. Once they saw the white wakes, the battleships would turn to avoid the torpedoes, possibly rendering Hagen's calculations useless. The only way to compensate was to fire a spread of torpedoes, spacing them so that regardless of which way the target turned, at least some torpedoes would hit. Hagen's hands moved quickly over the torpedo director controls. Target course 120 degrees, target speed 30 knots, range 10,000 yards and closing. Own course 270 degrees, own speed 38 knots. Torpedo speed 45 knots. He calculated lead angle of 65 degrees, meaning the torpedoes would be aimed 65 degrees ahead of the target's current position. The torpedo director transmitted the solution to the torpedo mounts, which trained their tubes to the calculated bearing. At 7:16 a.m., Evans gave the order, "Fire torpedoes." The torpedo officer pressed the firing button. Johnston's starboard torpedo mount, 5 tubes, fired in sequence, 1 torpedo every 2 seconds. The firing mechanism used compressed air to eject the torpedoes from their tubes. Each torpedo weighed 6,300 pounds. The ejection created massive recoil that shook the entire ship. The torpedoes hit the water with enormous splashes, immediately ignited their steam engines, and accelerated to 45 knots, leaving white wakes visible for miles. Gunner's mate, second class, Robert Hollenbaugh was stationed at the aft 5-inch gun mount, approximately 200 feet behind the torpedo mounts. He watched the torpedoes launch with mixture of awe and terror. He later described the moment. "Those fish went into the water, beautiful, perfect spread. But I looked up and saw those battleships, and I thought, we just poked the biggest bull in the world with a stick. Now he's going to turn around and kill us." Hollenbaugh's assessment was accurate. The torpedo's running time to target at 10,000 yards was approximately 4 minutes. Evans continued closing, firing his 5-inch guns continuously. Johnston's 5 guns were now firing at maximum rate, each gun firing 8 rounds per minute. Total rate of fire, 40 rounds per minute. The gun crews were working in rhythm that came from months of training. Load, aim, fire, eject shell casing, load again. The 54-pound shells arced through the air, taking 25 seconds to reach targets at maximum range. The gun crews couldn't see whether their shells were hitting, because explosions from Japanese shells returning fire created massive water spouts that obscured everything. But they kept firing, kept loading, kept aiming, because that was their job, and because their captain had ordered them to attack battleships. Chief Gunner's Mate John Ramsey, who commanded Gun Mount 52, the aftmost 5-inch gun, later said, "We knew we were dead men. We knew those battleships were going to kill us. But the captain said attack, so we attacked. You don't question orders like that. You just do your job until you can't do it anymore. At 7:18 a.m., Japanese lookouts aboard battleship Yamato spotted the torpedo wakes. The officer of the deck immediately ordered hard left rudder, attempting to turn the massive battleship parallel to the torpedo tracks so they would pass harmlessly down the ship's length. Yamato, despite displacing 72,000 tons, could turn relatively quickly due to her powerful rudders. But turning a ship that size took time. The rudder went over hard, the bow began swinging left, but momentum carried the ship forward along her original course. The torpedoes, running at 45 knots, closed the distance. At 7:20 a.m., they reached the Japanese formation. Yamato's turn was not quite complete. The first torpedo passed down Yamato's port side, missing by approximately 20 feet. The second torpedo struck Yamato's bow at the waterline, the 825-pound Torpex warhead detonating on contact. The explosion tore a hole approximately 15 feet in diameter in Yamato's hull below the waterline. Water rushed into the forward compartment, flooding it within seconds. The third torpedo struck Yamato amidships on her port side, detonating against her armor belt. The armor belt, 16 inches of hardened steel, prevented the torpedo from penetrating into Yamato's vital spaces. But the explosion created a massive dent in the armor and sprung hull plates above and below the impact point, allowing water to seep into the ship. The fourth and fifth torpedoes missed as Yamato completed her turn. But 2 hits on Yamato were extraordinary achievement for a destroyer. The damage was not fatal. Yamato's internal compartments were designed to contain flooding from multiple torpedo hits. But the forward flooding caused Yamato to settle by the bow, reducing her maximum speed from 27 knots to approximately 22 knots. More importantly, the damage forced Admiral Kurita to temporarily withdraw Yamato from the battle, while damage control parties assessed the flooding and determined whether the ship could continue fighting. Battleship Nagato also maneuvered to avoid Johnston's torpedoes, turning away from the American carriers and losing position in the Japanese formation. Heavy cruisers Kumano and Suzuya both turned hard to avoid the torpedoes, creating confusion in the Japanese formation as ships maneuvered independently rather than maintaining coordinated attack. The entire Japanese advance was disrupted for critical minutes, while ships evaded torpedoes and attempted to reorganize. Evans watched the chaos with satisfaction. Johnston had damaged the enemy flagship, disrupted the Japanese formation, and bought time for the escort carriers to withdraw. But the cost was about to come due. The Japanese heavy cruisers, seeing Johnston exposed during her torpedo attack, turned their full attention to destroying the destroyer that had dared to attack their battleships. At 7:24 a.m., 3 8-inch shells from heavy cruiser Kumano struck Johnston simultaneously. One hit the bridge, killing 3 men instantly and wounding Evans with shrapnel in his face and hand. One hit the aft engine room, disabling one of Johnston's 2 engines and reducing her speed to 17 knots. One hit the gun director, disabling the centralized fire control system and forcing each gun to aim independently. Evans, bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds, refused to leave the bridge. He wrapped his wounded hand in a rag and continued commanding. With only 1 engine operational, Johnston's speed was reduced to less than half her maximum. With damaged fire control, her guns were less accurate, but she was still afloat, still fighting, and still between the Japanese and the carriers. For the next 2 hours, Johnston fought a running battle against overwhelming odds. At 7:50 a.m., Japanese heavy cruisers closed to within 8,000 yards of the escort carriers, firing directly at the thin-skinned ships. Evans positioned Johnston between the cruisers and carriers, engaging the cruisers with his 5-inch guns at point-blank range. Johnston's shells, while unable to penetrate cruiser armor, damaged superstructure, destroyed gun mounts, and killed crew members exposed on deck. At 8:20 a.m., Japanese cruiser Kumano, which had already been hit by Johnston's torpedoes earlier, turned to engage Johnston directly. The 2 ships closed to 7,000 yards, trading fire at ranges where every shell could be decisive. Johnston fired 56 rounds in 6 minutes, achieving at least 12 hits on Kumano's superstructure and bow. Kumano fired approximately 40 rounds from her 8-inch guns, achieving 6 hits on Johnston that destroyed her remaining forward gun mount and killed 15 men. But Johnston's aggressive attack forced Kumano to turn away from the carriers to engage the destroyer, buying precious time. At 8:30 a.m., destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts joined Johnston's attack, engaging Japanese cruisers despite being even smaller and more lightly armed than Johnston. The two small ships fought the heavy cruisers to a standstill, preventing them from closing with the carriers. At 9 a.m., Japanese cruiser formation finally broke through the destroyer screen and began closing with the escort carriers. Evans made the decision to use his last 5 torpedoes against the cruisers, even though it meant getting within 5,000 yards of ships that could destroy Johnston with single salvos. He ordered the torpedo officer to fire at cruiser Kumano, the most aggressive pursuer. Johnston fired her last 5 torpedoes at 9:10 a.m. from 5,000 yards range. 3 hit Kumano, the explosions, tearing away her bow and forcing her to withdraw from the battle. Kumano would eventually sink from the damage Johnston inflicted, but using her last torpedoes left Johnston with only her remaining 5-inch guns and anti-aircraft weapons, inadequate armament for surface combat against cruisers and battleships. At 9:20 a.m., with her torpedoes expended and ammunition for her 5-inch guns running low, Johnston was surrounded by Japanese heavy cruisers and destroyers. Her situation was hopeless. She had been in continuous combat for 2 hours and 22 minutes. She had fired all 15 of her torpedoes. She had fired over 800 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, more than 80% of her total load. Her forward guns were destroyed, her engines were damaged, her steering was manual only, and fires burned throughout the ship. Japanese destroyer Fujinami, recognizing that Johnston was crippled and could no longer maneuver effectively, closed to 2,000 yards and fired a full salvo of 8 torpedoes at the damaged destroyer. At 2,000 yards, running time for the torpedoes was approximately 90 seconds. Johnston's crew spotted the torpedo wakes approaching. With only manual steering and 1 engine, they couldn't maneuver effectively to avoid them. Quartermaster 3rd Class Paul Rinn was at the manual steering station below decks, operating the ship's rudder by hand after the power steering system had been destroyed by shell hits. He heard the warning over the sound-powered phone system. Torpedoes approaching port side, brace for impact. He braced himself against the steering wheel and waited. The first torpedo struck forward of his position at 9:22 a.m., the explosion lifting the entire bow of the ship from the water. The shock wave traveled through the hull, throwing Rinn against the bulkhead. The second torpedo struck amidships, near the forward engine room, and Rinn heard the massive roar of the explosion, followed by the sound of rushing water. In the forward engine room, Machinist Mate 1st Class Fred Stowers and his crew had been fighting to keep Johnston's remaining engine operating for 2 hours while shells tore through the ship around them. They had maintained steam pressure despite hits that damaged pipes, ruptured fuel lines, and killed several crew members. When the torpedo hit just forward of their compartment, the explosion breached the engine room bulkhead. Water rushed in at catastrophic rate, thousands of gallons per second flooding into the machinery spaces. Stowers ordered his crew to abandon the engine room immediately. They scrambled up the ladder to the main deck, water rising behind them, reaching the ladder just as water filled the compartment to waist depth. They emerged onto the main deck to find it tilting at 10 degrees to port and settling rapidly by the bow. Smoke and steam vented from multiple shell holes. The forward third of the ship was underwater. Johnston was sinking. Evans was still on the bridge, his face and uniform covered in blood from shrapnel wounds he'd received over 2 hours earlier. His left hand was wrapped in a bloody rag where shrapnel had torn through it. He had refused medical treatment, refused to leave the bridge, refused to acknowledge his injuries. Now, seeing his ship sinking beneath him, he made the hardest decision a naval captain can make. He picked up the sound-powered phone handset and gave the order that every captain dreads. "All hands, this is the captain. Abandon ship. I repeat, abandon ship. All hands abandon ship immediately." The order passed through the ship via sound-powered phones, voice tubes, and word of mouth. In some compartments, men were already abandoning because flooding was imminent. In other compartments, men continued fighting fires or treating wounded shipmates until they received the order. Chief Boatswain's mate Joseph Garza was in charge of launching the life rafts. Most of the rafts had been destroyed by shell hits during the battle, torn apart by explosions or riddled with shrapnel. Garza and his crew found 3 rafts that were still inflatable, pulled the inflation cords, and threw the rafts over the side into the water. Men began jumping from the sinking ship. Some dove cleanly from the deck, swimming away from the ship to avoid being pulled down by suction as she sank. Others, wounded and unable to swim, clung to debris or were helped into life rafts by shipmates. Pharmacist's mate. Third Class James Murphy, who had been treating wounded men in the makeshift sickbay below decks, refused to abandon ship until he had evacuated all his patients. He helped carry wounded men to the main deck, assisted them into life rafts, and only then jumped into the water himself. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the torpedo officer who had calculated the firing solution that damaged Yamato, was helping wounded men abandon ship when he saw Commander Evans still on the bridge. Hagen climbed the ladder to the bridge and found Evans standing at his command station, watching his crew abandon ship, making sure everyone got off safely before he would consider leaving himself. Hagen said, "Captain, we have to go. The ship is going down." Evans replied, "Make sure everyone is off. I'll be right behind you." Hagen returned to the main deck and continued helping men into the water. He looked back at the bridge several times, expecting to see Evans climbing down. But Evans remained at his post, watching through binoculars, counting heads in the water, ensuring all his men were clear. The exact number of men aboard Johnston at the time she was abandoned was never definitively established, but estimates placed it at approximately 190 men still alive out of the original crew of 327. At 9:45 a.m., Johnston rolled onto her port side, water pouring into every opening, dragging her down. Men in the water, swimming away from the sinking ship, looked back and saw their captain still on the bridge. Some witnesses later reported that Evans saluted the flag as the ship went down, though given the chaos and the fact that most witnesses were injured and in shock, this detail cannot be confirmed. What is certain is that Evans was last seen on the bridge as Johnston rolled over and began her final plunge. The ship sank bow first, her stern rising into the air, propellers visible above the water, a sight that sailors describe as one of the most terrible in naval warfare. She hung in that position for approximately 30 seconds, bow already underwater, stern pointing toward the sky, balanced at the moment between floating and sinking. Then she slid beneath the surface, disappearing into the Philippine Sea in less than a minute from the time she rolled over. As Johnston disappeared, Japanese destroyer Fujinami, which had fired the torpedoes that finished the American destroyer, passed close to the men in the water. The Japanese destroyer captain, watching Johnston sink, reportedly ordered his crew to stand at attention and salute the sinking ship. This gesture of respect between enemies was later confirmed by Japanese sailors who survived the war. The Japanese captain was reported to have said to his crew, "That destroyer fought like a battleship. Show respect." The survivors of Johnston, approximately 190 men, were now in the water 50 miles from the nearest land with no immediate prospect of rescue. Many were wounded, bleeding from shrapnel injuries or burns. Their life jackets were standard Navy Kapok life vests, designed to keep a man afloat but providing minimal protection from exposure. The water temperature was approximately 82 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent immediate hypothermia, but not comfortable for extended immersion. More dangerous were the sharks that infested these waters, attracted by blood from wounded men. Ensign William Taff, one of Johnston's junior officers, organized the survivors into groups around the 3 life rafts that had been successfully launched. Men who could swim strongly were assigned to help wounded men stay afloat. Men in the life rafts made room for the most seriously wounded. Taft conducted head count and determined that approximately 190 men had survived the sinking, but many were wounded and would die from their injuries over the next hours unless rescue came quickly. The battle off Samar continued around them for another 30 minutes. The surviving escort carriers, having been protected by Johnston and the other destroyers' sacrifice, launched continuous air attacks against the Japanese force. American aircraft, running low on ammunition and fuel, made strafing runs against Japanese ships even when they had no weapons left, simply to harass and distract Japanese gunners. The continuous attacks, combined with the aggressive destroyer attacks, created an impression in Admiral Kurida's mind that he was facing a much larger American force than actually existed. At 9:25 a.m., 20 minutes before Johnston sank, Kurita ordered his force to withdraw. The decision was controversial, and has been debated by historians ever since. Kurita had overwhelming superiority in ships and firepower. The American escort carriers were within his grasp, running at their maximum speed of 19 knots, while his battleships could make 27 knots. He could have caught and destroyed them within an hour. But the destroyer attacks, particularly Johnston's aggressive charge, convinced him he was facing prepared resistance rather than the surprised and disorganized force that actually opposed him. The Japanese center force turned northwest and withdrew through San Bernardino Strait, ending the battle off Samar. The escort carriers survived. The invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf, which had been completely undefended against the Japanese battleships, was saved. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, which included the battle off Samar as its final action, resulted in overwhelming American victory. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The combined fleet was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Japan would never again threaten American naval operations in the Pacific. The survivors of Johnston remained in the water for over 48 hours before being rescued. During that time, approximately 45 men died from their wounds, from drowning, or from shark attacks. The sharks were constant presence, circling the groups of survivors, occasionally attacking isolated men or those who had died from wounds and drifted away from the groups. The survivors fought off sharks by splashing water and hitting them with debris when they approached too close. On October 27, 1944, 2 days after Johnston sank, American destroyer escorts searching the area spotted survivors in the water and rescued them. Of Johnston's original crew of 327, only 141 survived to be rescued. Ernest Evans was not among them. His body was never recovered. He was officially listed as killed in action, presumed to have gone down with his ship. The Navy began the process of awarding decorations for the battle off Samar within weeks of the battle. Johnston was recommended for the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest unit awards. Ernest Evans was recommended for the Medal of Honor, the highest individual decoration for valor. The recommendation was approved quickly, and Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor on May 27, 1946. The citation, presented to his widow Mildred and his children at ceremony in Washington, D.C., read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, as commanding officer of the USS Johnston in action against major units of the enemy Japanese fleet during the battle off Samar, October 25, 1944. The first to lay a smokescreen and to open fire as an enemy task force, vastly superior in number, firepower, and armor, rapidly approached. Commander Evans gallantly diverted the powerful blows of the enemy from the lightly armed and armored carriers under his protection, launching a desperate attack through the hail of shell fire. The battle off Samar continued for another 30 minutes after Johnston sank. The surviving escort carriers, having been protected by Johnston and the other destroyers' sacrifice, launched aircraft that attacked the Japanese force with bombs, torpedoes, and eventually just strafing runs when ammunition was exhausted. The continuous air attacks, combined with the aggressive destroyer attacks, convinced Admiral Kurita that he was facing a much larger American force than actually existed. At 9:25 a.m., 25 minutes before Johnston sank, Kurita ordered his force to withdraw. The Japanese center force, which had been poised to destroy the invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf, turned around and retreated through San Bernardino Strait. They had been stopped by 6 escort carriers and 7 screening ships, of which 3 were sunk. The invasion fleet was saved. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, which included the battle off Samar as its final action, was an overwhelming American victory. Of Johnston's 327 crew members, 186 were killed or missing, including Commander Evans. 141 survived, most wounded and adrift in the Philippine Sea for hours before rescue. The survivors spent up to 2 days in the water, fighting off sharks, suffering from exposure and wounds, before being picked up by American ships. Ernest Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously on May 27, 1946, presented to his widow and children by President Harry Truman. The citation read, in part, "Outgunned and outmaneuvered by the enemy force, Commander Evans maneuvered his ship into a position of attack and launched a vigorous assault against the Japanese battle line, Fighting furiously in the face of overwhelming fire, he drove home his attack to torpedo range and scored damaging hits on one of the enemy battleships. USS Johnston was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, one of only 3 destroyers so honored during World War II. The citation noted that Johnston fought with extraordinary heroism against overwhelming odds, materially contributing to the defeat of a major Japanese attack force. Modern naval historians consider the Battle off Samar the greatest upset in naval history. A force of escort carriers and destroyers, designed for support roles and grossly outmatched, defeated a battleship force through aggressive tactics and willingness to accept casualties. The battle changed naval doctrine regarding destroyer employment, demonstrating that smaller vessels properly handled could defeat superior forces through aggression and tactical innovation. Evans's Native American heritage became part of his legend. He embodied warrior traditions of his Cherokee ancestors, leading from the front, accepting personal risk, fighting for his crew and mission regardless of personal cost. The Navy has honored his memory by naming multiple ships after him, most recently USS Ernest E. Evans, DDG-141, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer currently under construction and scheduled for commissioning in 2025. The wreck of USS Johnston was discovered in October 2019 by undersea explorer Victor Vescovo at depth of 180 feet in the Philippine Sea, the deepest shipwreck ever found. The wreck sits upright on the seafloor, bow torn away by torpedo hits, but otherwise remarkably intact. Photographs of the wreck show her guns still pointed toward where the Japanese battleships were when she sank, frozen in her final moment of defiance. October 25, 1944, lasted 2 hours and 37 minutes from the moment Ernest Evans ordered Johnston to attack until she sank beneath the Philippine Sea. 1 destroyer against 4 battleships. Mathematics said impossible. Doctrine said suicidal. Evans said necessary. When 2,050 tons charged 72,000 tons and won through sheer courage, when a destroyer fought like a battleship and saved a fleet, when 1 Native American captain proved that honor and duty outweigh survival. USS Johnston, commissioned October 27, 1943, attacked 4 Japanese battleships. October 25, 1944, damaged battleship Yamato, sank heavy cruiser Kumano, saved 6 escort carriers and invasion fleet. Commander Ernest Evans awarded Medal of Honor posthumously. Ship awarded Presidential Unit Citation. Wreck discovered 2019 at 21,380 feet depth. Deepest shipwreck ever found. Not because winning was possible, because fighting was necessary. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of impossible courage and ultimate sacrifice. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We honor those who charged when they should have run, who fought when they should have died. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.